What I'd like to talk to you about today is about negotiation, because along the way, you kind of run across a few situations. And what I'd like to do is share with you a framework I've used for negotiation, but also a couple of funny stories along the way of how it's worked out for me, and the people on the other side of the table haven't necessarily been from the same culture as I am. I would characterise the international factor in negotiation into two things. And I think very broadly, there are two types of business relationship. And I am generalising on a massive scale here. On the one extreme, you've got what I would call a transactional relationship, where you discuss something, you agree something, you write a contract, and you execute that contract. And if the ladies in the room will excuse my language, if you don't execute the contract, I'll cut your balls off. But that's a transactional relationship. It's most prevalent in the US, certainly prevalent in the UK, certainly prevalent in Germany. But it's a transactional relationship. We agree something, we write it down, we do it. The other extreme is a relationship, where broadly it's based on I trust you. Yeah, I know. And with that are endless pitfalls. And perhaps the example I give you of that is when we first moved to Cyprus, we bought a house here. And we agreed a contract. And being broadly an Anglo-Saxon of Irish descent and all those sorts of things, I assumed the contract was a contract. The developer, of course, had a completely different view. He was going to build a house for me. Whether it was going to be a house I wanted was another question. Whether it was going to be in the timescale I wanted was another question. But there was a relationship. And so long as the relationship worked, he built a beautiful house. The moment the relationship stopped working, he didn't build a beautiful house. So they're the two extremes. I'm not going to try and do an order and say, well, the US is here and the UK is there and da-da-da-da. But if you just keep at the back of your mind, there's those two broad extremes, and somewhere, the guy on the other side of the table is somewhere on those extremes, and maybe different to you, that's a pretty fair start point. If we now look at a negotiation model, this is one I use, it's fairly widely used, but people have different models. Broadly, I break it down into four things. What's the goal? What do we want to do? Second step is, what do we know about this situation? What do we know about what we want? What do we know about what they want? What options can we create to make this more interesting? And then finally, what do we need to do to push this into action? And I hate, by the way, the phrase win-win negotiating. Whenever anybody says to me, win-win style negotiator, I make sure I've got very firm grip with my wallet. Because the minute anybody says that, what they mean is I'm here to stiff you. Okay? So there's the model. Keep it in the back of your head as we zip on through. I'll try and be as quick as I can with this without conscious of time. So let's talk a little bit about goals. The first thing that really matters is to be really clear about what the goal is you're trying to achieve. Now it can be a confusing this one, and I find it's very helpful to keep asking why? Why do I want this? Until I get down to a real hard goal. And then when you've got there, you then need to keep testing your actions against, are they taking me towards this goal or are they not taking me towards this goal? Now, the example I would give is, my wife's here today, and like all good relationships, 90% of the time we have a swimmingly wonderful relationship, 10% of the time I go looking for her with a chainsaw. Why do I do that? It's because we get into an argument. And the argument is about something like, it's your turn to do the washing up. No, it isn't. But that goes off into all sorts of other territory about who is actually going to do the washing up, and all sorts of other factors get brought into it. And everybody forgets it's about who's going to do the washing up. Now, in my mind, it's very easy to do that in a negotiation as well. If you're there to negotiate a contract and you want to get to the conclusion, is everything taking you to the conclusion, or isn't it? A helpful test on the way of this is it a smart objective you've got? Smart being specific, measurable, achievable, resource at the time. But if you pick up the goal and it passes that smart test, you've got a reasonable goal. And that's the base to start with. The next interesting question, of course, is what is their goal? Now, there's a couple of possibilities here. You can probably figure out what they want, but it's worth taking a fair amount of time to make sure you really figure out what it is they want, because there may be subtleties along the way that you've missed. The other interesting test at this point is their goal achievable? If they want something we can't do, or they want something we're not prepared to do, maybe the best thing to do is to part friends then. Save everybody a lot of time on that. Because if that's true, there's just no point going into those countries. And the final one in that one is there any personal motivations to consider? And you'd be amazed the difference personal factors make. An example I'll give you is, when I first came here, I was retained to do some work to sell something, believe it or not, with sewerage systems. You know, sometimes you don't get the best of jobs. But I was new here, and it was go and try and sell this sewerage system stuff. So living in Paphos, I found a couple of sewage board, maybe something. See somebody, and we had a very pleasant meeting, and we got into a discussion, and we got into a negotiation. I couldn't get there. I just couldn't get to a conclusion. I couldn't figure out why. So eventually, Cyprus being Cyprus, we were having a salad for lunch. And it turned out this guy lives in Tremekthousa. I don't know how well anybody here knows Paphos, but Tremekthousa is kind of above the town. Quite a bit above the town. This guy was a keen cyclist. He loved cycling to work in the morning. Pretty much he got on his bike, didn't touch the pedals all the way to work. But when it came to come home again in the evening, not quite so good, didn't know he had to pedal on the hill. There's a kind of hill, and it's a long hill. So we got to chatting about this, and I discovered that what he really wanted was an electric bike. Now, to pick up on something Graham said earlier on, what he really wanted was somebody could give him an electric bike. But of course, I wouldn't do such a thing as a local government official in Scotland. Wouldn't agree. But what I did do is go and find him a place where he could buy an electric bike cheaply. When I found him on eBay in the UK, when I took him through the process, I bid for it, he won it, he was happy, he got his electric bike. I got the business. So therefore, personal motivations are a huge factor. Well, I thought I was selling 100,000 euros worth of sewage equipment. I wasn't. I was selling an electric bike. Crazy. But there you go. You've got to recognise these things. So, past the goal stage, next stage is the analysis stage. And this is where you need to do a huge amount of thinking. Well, the obvious one is there's people involved. And since we're talking here in an international context, we're talking about people potentially of different cultures, different upbringings, different perceptions to you. So who are these people? Question number one. What can we find out about them? What can we find out about their personal motivations? Do they want an electric bike to get done? Are they empowered? Now this one's critical because it's very easy to have a long negotiation with somebody and get to the end of it and then say, well, that's all very nice and fine. Now I need to take it to my boss. Maybe you're starting again, you're back to basics. So finding out that the power at the table really is the power at the table really matters. In an international context, one thing I found very useful is to be able to figure out are there any third parties who could influence these people. Now that could be reference customers I can bring to bear to say, well look, we did it for him and therefore we could do it for you, would be an example. Trade bodies would be another example you can bring to body to bear. You know, best practice in your industry is according to, and therefore if you did this it would be a good thing. The killer one, frankly, is to go to their customers and talk to their customers and figure out from their customers what the shortcomings in the company are, and then go back and use the customers as influence. Sounds dangerous, or it doesn't work, because now you can talk very specifically about very specific problems. The second part of this is about their perceptions and interests. And you can't even get into a negotiation unless you find a point where everybody's in agreement. Now that might be a long way back. The point of agreement might be, I think that's black and you think that's white. But can we both agree that you think that's black and I think that's white? But you need to start somewhere where there is a level of agreement, and then work onwards. And what you're looking for are where are the gaps? Where do I believe this is the case, and where do you believe that is not the case? And you're looking for the gaps, and what you can do to close those gaps and join them together. A final one I find beautifully powerful, and it works everywhere, is find out what their standards are. Now perhaps the best example of a standard I can give you is, the last time I went to the UK was about 6 months ago. And I arrived at Manchester Airport at something like midnight, and of course because it was the UK it was absolutely tipping down with rain. And the rent-a-car place was on the roof of the car park. So I went up there struggling with my case on one end and a briefcase on the other, and the rain was slashing down. And all I wanted to do was get into a car with a GPS to go to the hotel I knew was about 8 kilometres away. That's all I was interested in. And when I got there, I was confronted with, well, we haven't got the car of your grade, this problem, that problem, the other problem. But this rent-a-car company, bless their hearts, thank you, had written on the sign, a huge sign behind the guy who was telling me why he couldn't help me. There was this huge sign that said, "We aim to delight our customers." So eventually I said to this guy, I said, just stop it, stop. Tell me, if you turn around and read that, what does it say? So he went, well, I'm trying to delight you. So I said, if I phoned your managing director and related this conversation, would he agree that you're trying to delight me? And he said, well, no, he wouldn't. So I said, good. Let's stop messing about with this. It's tipping down with rain outside. Can I please have a rent-a-car? And can I please be driving it in 2 minutes? Do you know what? I booked a Golf, I drove away in a BMW. That's using standards. If you're doing it in a big company context, you go looking at their website, you go looking at their mission statement. What does their mission statement say? Go look at their company report. What does their chairman's statement say? Look at things that they're saying in their website as how they try to attract customers. And those are wonderful standards you can bring up in a negotiation to say, do you really think, now look, on your website it says this. Do you really think that behaviour is in line with this? It's very, very powerful. Final thing is you're trying to create some options. And there's the one situation in my mind you want to step away from at all times is getting down to a situation of your price is too high. If you move the price up the right, i.e. a single factor, and that single factor being price. Because then you're on a road to nowhere. So I have this expression called make the pie bigger. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to bring other factors into play which are as important as the price, so that you never get to the situation of it's this price or that price. So for example, how's whatever this is going to get delivered? How whatever is this going to get installed? How are they going to get trained to use it? How is it going to get supported? Those are all very fruitful grounds to find other things that are important, that you can begin to join together to make the pie bigger. And there's 2 lines of thinking which are interesting. The first one is, what's got value to them, but doesn't have value to you? So that's a great thing to give away. But the other way to think about it is, what's got more value to us than it has to them, which are the things you do not want to give away. Or if you do, you want to charge. But they're 2 very productive lines of thinking to come up with options to make the pie bigger. And if I take you back to making the pie bigger, if, for example, one of the things that make the pie bigger is training, and you know that on your company's website there is a whole bunch of videos that train people how to use whatever it is you're selling, then, hey, it's costing you nothing, but you can offer them free training. That's the sort of way it works. And then the final point is, if you've got this situation going on, think ahead. What are the things you're going to join together? So when they say, we want training, what's the thing you're going to ask for to come back? And I find it very helpful to actually write that up as a sort of schedule of what are the things I want, what are the things they want, and join together. So when they ask for this, I'm going to ask for that. So, when it comes to this, trying to make the pie bigger, I find it very helpful to, I'm talking a big situation here, I find it very helpful to have a kind of brainstorming session going on, where there's no rules, just write ideas down, nobody judges the ideas, and we'll all come back and look at the ideas later. And you can come up with some absolutely stupid ideas in the process of doing so. But in the process of doing so, some of those crazy ideas may not be just quite as crazy as you think they are. Now, the example I'll give you of that one is, I'm trying to think how long ago, 5 or 6 years ago, I was involved in negotiating what was an IT outsourcing contract with a part of the Atomic Energy Authority in the UK. And the work we were trying to get was for the IT services part of it. But we were up against some pretty stiff competition, and we were in a situation where there were things they wanted us to do that we were struggling a little bit with, and it was a funny old situation. But when we did the brainstorming bit, somebody came up with the idea of, instead of limiting it to IT, why don't we go for all the back office services, the whole lot, and put it in as a speculative bid? And I remember thinking, that is the wackiest, stupidest, craziest idea I've ever heard. But it just might work. And it did. Ultimately, instead of winning a £10 million piece of business, we ended up winning a £40 million piece of business. And it came out of a crazy idea that they brainstormed. Second consideration here are risks. What happens when things go wrong? This is where your lawyer starts sitting on your shoulder saying, everything's going to go wrong, everything's going to go wrong, gloom and doom, gloom and doom. But the trick is to figure out where the risks are, and what either you can do to manage them, or if they're their risks, what you can do to help them manage them. There's also an interesting little thing comes up in this one. When you get into this sort of discussion with somebody in a negotiation, if they start hammering you on a point, it gives you a very good clue as to the way they're thinking. And I had a very recent example where I was in a situation where this was going on, and I was absolutely hammered about the delivery terms, how accurate the deliveries were, when the deliveries happened. I could answer all the questions, no trouble at all, because the organisation I was representing had a perfect delivery record, so I had no trouble asking them. But what it told me was that when they were going to be involved in doing deliveries to us, there were potentially problems, because they kept on about deliveries, so it was obviously in their mind a problematic subject. And it helped us in the negotiation, because we were able to push back very hard on how they were going to deal with us, and how we were going to make that work. So the final thing is, what does a great outcome look like? And again, I find it very helpful to try and figure out other ways of looking at the same set of facts. You've obviously been there. You know, she's saying, it's like this, and I'm saying, you're absolutely right, it's like this, but there's war going on in the middle and the chainsaw's out. But actually, it's the same set of facts. It's just we're looking at it in different ways. And in an international context, this happens all the time. All the time. Because you're dealing, almost by definition, with people with a different set of perceptions than your own. And the final one, obviously, is how can you make your own proposition the most appealing. That's very obvious. So, let's try and wrap it up now into some action. How is negotiation itself run? So we've now done our preparation, we've worked out what our options, and we're sat across the table from this charming group of people who are all smiling at us. The first thing is to figure out who is who, and in the best context of a football team, figure out who is going to mark who. Because if you've got their, quote, God at their table, you need to make damn sure you've got your God on your side of the table. Because if there isn't, there's going to be problems. You alluded to earlier on that further east, sorry, Graham, alluded earlier on to that further east you go, the more you find hierarchy. And that's especially true here. And you need to match hierarchy to hierarchy. And if they're bringing in somebody important, you need to bring in somebody important. If they brought in a tech specialist, you need to bring in a tech specialist. But you need to mark them, just like a football team. The other one I always find handy is to take with me somebody who says nothing. They're there as a note taker. But their real job is to watch the body language. Because body language tells you so very much. And having somebody in your team is watching the body language on the other side of the table, and that's specifically what they are for. They might be taking some notes as well as a cover. But to be actually watching what's going on is so helpful. Clearly listen more than you speak. Because the moment you do that, three things happen. The first thing is, they like you. Everybody likes talking. Everybody likes to be listened to. So if you shut up and let them do the talking, hallelujah, you're their best friend. The second thing that happens is, they're doing all the talking, so they think they're in control. are asking the questions. Questions are always power. But they think they're in control, which when you're negotiating, if the third table thinks it's in control, that's a nice place to be. And then the third one is, the more they talk, the more information they'll give away. And the more potential options you can develop, the bigger the pie, the bigger the cake you can make, you're going to get more information. So I try and sit there, say minimum, ask as many questions as possible, say nothing. Have no views until it matters, because you will learn so much. Commitment always comes in baby steps. If you go for the biggie, forget it. Now, again, if the ladies in the room will forgive me, if I walked up to an attractive girl in the bar and said, "Can I take you home and sleep with you?" she'd say probably no. If I said, "You fancy a drink?" maybe I get to a yes, who knows. But it's a perfect example of baby steps get you to the result you want.
Very right, here.
I know. She was once in a bar.
Did you follow the steps?
I did, and look what it got me. The second point, now again we're talking international here, remember, is get commitments in the way they make commitments, not the way you make commitments. Yeah. So if it's and test, are you sure they're committed to what they say they're committed to? Now, an example I'll give you to illustrate this one is, I hadn't been working here very long, and I started doing some work with a big company in Excel. And Graham will know that in the UK, the first thing you do when you go to see a new client is you take a non-disclosure agreement with you, what it says, anything you tell me, keep secret, and anything I tell you, you'll keep secret, and we'll look at you today, it's confidence. So, I went to this meeting with a non-disclosure agreement. And at the end of the meeting, I got it out of my bag, stand in practice, put it down the desk and said, "I'd like to do this." And the guy looked at me as if I'd grown horns and a tail. And he was like, "You want me to sign that?" So I was like, "Well, if it's an issue, well, no." I said, "Look, do you trust me or don't?" He says, "Well, yes, I trust you." I said, "Fine, we don't need that." But it's a perfect example of how do you give commitment, and in what form does it come. Now, the final step, of course, is keep things moving. What's the next step? The worst thing that can happen in negotiation is discussion to stop. You need to keep things moving. And again, I'm sorry, my wife's taking the brunt of this one, but perfect example, you're having an argument at home. And when you get to the, "Well, you can go and there then," and slam the door and march away, discussion is finished. There is no progress. When you come back and open the door and say, "Look, I'm sorry, let's talk a bit more about this," then discussion starts again. Now, I'm not suggesting that you, well, no, I've actually had it happen to me. I was negotiating with a very big travel company in the UK, and they had this buyer who they thought was it. And he drove this BMW sports car and had this beautiful leather briefcase. He thought it was it. So we were negotiating with him over a networking contract, and he started asking like really stupid questions, like, "What's your cost pricing?" Now, am I going to tell him that? So eventually got to the point where he did this big ritual slamming of the briefcase and marching off out the door. So he thought, fine, okay, he needs us. Let's see what happens next. And I had to wait 3 days before he called me back. He said, "Mike, we need to go and have lunch." And I said, "Yeah, that's a great idea." So keep talking. What's the deadline? If you can find out what their deadline is and not have one yourself, that's a very nice place to be. Now, I was involved in negotiating a contract with Century a couple of years ago, and we knew that the impact we were going to have on their business if they went ahead with us was sufficient that they would want to report it when they quarterly results. We knew when the quarterly results were going to be announced, we knew the timetable that went before it, we knew board meetings that came before it and everything. So we knew the schedule that led to where they needed to get to. So of course, every time one of those deadlines was coming up, guess what happened? "Oh look, can we phone and cancel this afternoon's meeting? I'm really sorry, we can't make it. Could we come the day after tomorrow?" And you forced them every time. They never clocked what we did. Every time we forced them right up against their own deadlines, to the point where when we got to having the meetings, it was a walk in the park. Because they pretty much had to say yes to what we were agreeing to get to the next stage. This all sounds very Machiavellian. I don't go into a negotiation to lose, but I do go into a negotiation to make sure the person at the side table thinks correctly too. So the final thing is you've got to end up with who's going to do what, and you need to come up with an action list of who's going to do what. So let's try and summarise this down. I'd say there's two things to think about. The first one is preparation is everything. If you walk into a situation and there are no surprises, that is the biggest success you can have. If you thought through all the permutations, all the possibilities. I love playing chess. It's one of my passions. I love planning 3 or 4 moves ahead. Passionate. And if you can do the same thing in a negotiation, figure out where they might go next, you're so prepared, so ready. Bring me your worst. But equally, I also try to get them to do as much preparation as they can. Because that way, you get to a better outcome. I know it sounds crazy to effectively trying to help the person on the other side of the table, but it's not. Because if they thought about how to multiply bigger, and if they thought about alternate possibilities, and if they thought about how they might manage my risk, we get to a much better situation. So getting them to do the prep as well makes a huge amount of sense, because you get to a better deal. And to use that expression I hate so much, you really do get to a win-win negotiation. If we turn it to the international dimension, it's very much a case of being sensitive to cultural factors. Now, how can I best illustrate this? Graham sort of almost went there a few minutes ago, as he talked about if you look at a race collectively, they're like this, but if you look at them individually, they're like that. And that, to me, is quite a helpful way of thinking about things. Is if you look at a group of people and say, well, they are generically this, you've got preconceptions and you've got things in your head which may not be helpful. Whereas if you look at this person as a person, and they're an individual, you treat them as an individual and you get on with them much better and you get to a much better outcome. I find it critical, absolutely critical, to think about what their perceptions might be. And to really test, what are they really trying to think here? And go out and take advice, go and talk to people, go and break them off one at a time and have coffees with them or whatever, to try and figure out what their perceptions are. Because they're coming from a different cultural background, their perceptions could be completely different to mine. And therefore really working at that to get out what are their perceptions is critical. And then the final one is to use as much as you possibly can of their approach and their standards. Remember the rent-a-car? Use as much as you possibly can of their approach and their standards. Because that way they're feeling at home, they're feeling comfortable, they're feeling around, they understand things are going the way they expect them to go. Yeah? They're happy. And happy people on the other side of a negotiating table is the best result you could possibly get. Thanks so much for your time, guys.